Okay, so what we're going to work on today is how to identify the parts of a story and how to use those parts in a story when creating your own story. The main topic for this is called story elements or maybe plot. And it's going to look pretty familiar because you've had this as a standard for the past several years. But the basic idea is when you have a story, it follows kind of a mountain-shaped pattern. And if you remember from the past couple of years, your mountain-shaped pattern starts off with something called the exposition. And the exposition is the part that gives you background information about the characters and about the setting and about just what's going on in general in your story. Now, as that develops, it moves into what's called the rising action. And that's just the part where the story starts moving along. You start finding out what's going on in the story and what the conflict is. You're finding out who is having problems with whom. As that conflict develops in your rising action, it's going to come to a point where the problem is going to have to be solved one way or another. And the part of the story where that problem is getting solved is the climax. So the climax is the part where, say that your rising action has been these two people that have been having issues and they're eventually going to have to fight it out. Say you've got two boxers and they're building up to the match where they're going to have their final showdown. That climax is going to be the boxing match. It's that part where they're put in the same area where they're going to have to duke it out and solve their problem. Now, the next part is the falling action. That's what happens to the characters right after the climax, like immediately after. So you've got this fight, they're duking it out, one knocks the other out. From the second that other character hits the mat, that's the falling action. So it's what happens right after that problem is solved, of knowing you've got these two people having issues, they're going to solve it. From then on is the falling action. It's what happens immediately after the climax. Now, the last part, the resolution or the denouement, is what happens in the long term after that. So if you've got this example of these two people preparing for a boxing match, the exposition might be where we find out who the characters are, find out that they've got an issue and that one is challenging the other. The rising action would be them continuing to have issues with each other, maybe trash talking, maybe the build up to the fight. One of the characters would probably have some kind of obstacle they have to overcome. The climax would be the actual fight scene. The falling action would be like what's going on in the ring after the fight, maybe what's going on that night. And then the resolution, the long term, would be what happens to that person or those characters in the long term. So like, because he won the fight, he was able to win the prize money and buy a nice home for his family, and they're not poor anymore, and they're able to go to the school they want to go to or move to the city they want to move to or whatever. It's that long term what happens after the climax. Now, for our notes, we've got three things that we need to keep in mind about our exposition. And the first thing, or the three things, are the three things we learn. So we learn the setting of our story. And I'm going to switch to the text tool so this can be easier to see. So we learn the setting, we learn the characters, and we learn what's going on in general in the story. Sometimes we call this the basic situation. The rising action, we're going to define that as a series of events. They don't have to be unfortunate events, they're just events. The climax in the story is the point in the story when the problem or conflict is solved. Falling action is what happens immediately after the climax. And the denouement or the resolution, this is the happily ever after. So like in fairy tales, when like Cinderella lives happily ever after, that's the resolution part, the things that she's doing that makes her live happily ever after. So she moves into the castle, she becomes the princess, that's the resolution. So it's what happens in the long term after the problem is solved. So in a nutshell, these are the things that make up story elements or plot. And that's it. It's something every story has. And when you're doing your own writing, it's something that you can use to give you direction to be able to craft your story so that it has the parts that'll make it interesting.